Here is Pennonia Poison Green. And first, what an amazing name. Now, this is a teal ink that shows some red sheen in the swatch, but the sheen isn't in the writing sample. There is a very noticeable tone shift from paper to paper. Really look at the tone changes from Clairfontaine to Rhodia. This does tend to shade well on most papers, though. On non-fountain pen friendly paper, this ink unleashed a fury on the page. Underneath, frequently bleeding. This makes this a horrible ink for students to use unless that student only uses composition lab notebooks. I write a lot on different papers and need to not worry about the ink. Even though I frequently use premium stuff at work, I go out of my way to do it. But I am writing on all different kinds of paper all day long. For this, I pass on this ink, but the color is pretty cool.
The pen for today is a Visconti Homo sapiens. Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how we got there by looking at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
Really cool, darker teal that I'm going to keep calling it a teal and classifying it there, but I'm going to go ahead and let them have it as a green, I guess. It doesn't feather, doesn't spread, shades well on this bright white Clairfontaine. You can see it. Let's look at let on the first line, where the L is much lighter than the ET at the end. Looking at if on the third line, it's as if one half of the I is like in the stroke of the I. Half of it looks a little darker than the other. It's really interesting in what's happening. Quite nice. Looking at the back of the page, now none of these spots I'm going to circle bled through to touch the page underneath, but this is Clairfontaine that it's getting deep into the paper of. I probably would still write back here. That is kind of a warning sign, though ghosting is not a problem.
Pennonia makes more than just one ink. Let's take a look at a few other inks from Pennonia.
Here is Pennonia Dungo Wasp. Here is Pennonia Lila Arniac Purple Shadow. Here is Pennonia Sour Cherry.
The second writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter notebook.
Here we can see that the tone is lighter than we had on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, does not spread. It does shade nowhere near as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. Nonsense, you say. Nonsense here shows much more shading, but most of the words don't show this type of shading. Most of the writing that we see here is like writing on the third line, where the W is darker, the R gets a little bit lighter, but the I ting at the end stays dark. Looking at the back of the page, now there's a number of spots where it does get deeper into the page. These are the spots that bled through, touching the page underneath. There is some ghosting. I would not write on the back of this page. I might be, I probably wouldn't because of how deep it gets in general. I would just be concerned even about getting spots on that next page.
There's a lot to be learned by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is done the way it's supposed to be done. A line of ink is put down to immediately put into water to show the separation of those colors, making the ink. Now the one on the right is marked with a D. This is allowed to dry for 10 minutes before it's put into water. The third writing sample is done in a national brand Steno notebook.
Here the tone is a whole lot lighter than it is on the Clairfontaine, also more green leaning. Now we do see some feathering that does occur. This feathering tends to come with the shading. So spoiler, we do get to see certain bits of shading, but they come with a consequence. There's no problem for spread. Yes, it shades. The tone means that, or the tone shift means that what we've got is a little more translucent of an ink being affected by the tone of the paper. Looking at the back of the page, we see it got very deep into the paper, an awful lot. A little more ghosting than I would prefer because of that. But these spots that are pre-circled, these all were bleeding through, touching the page underneath. It really peppered that next page, and it kind of distracts that next time writing when you're seeing these little spots. This I would avoid on this paper.
Resistance tests are done to see how well this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. Now, this smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. In the upper left, you can see where there is highlighter. In the upper right, that is pen flush. The lower left has a 1/3 bleach solution, and the lower right has plain old water. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
This is very noticeably lighter and very noticeably more green leaning than it was on the Clairfontaine. Huge difference to me in person in what I'm seeing. Hopefully it works out in the color correction in the edit. It does not feather, does not spread. The shading is clearly defined. Look at defined on the second line, where the bottom of the D is lighter than the top of the D. Nice mid-tone into the E, very dark F-I-N-E-D at the end. It stands out against the quad rule without any kind of a problem, making it good to use if you prefer quad rule paper. Looking at the back of the page, it's not ghosting that's a problem. It is deep into the paper that is a problem. There is a lot of these spots. Now, none of these spots touch the page underneath. They did not bleed through, but there is a lot of very deep into this coated paper. Something to be warned about.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at a few more teal or turquoise inks.
Here is Noodler's Turquoise Eel. Here is Private Reserve Blue Suede. Here is Sailor Studio 764. Here is Visconti Turquoise.
All of the inks that you just saw have a review here on the channel. Now, the next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Here the tone is lighter, flatter, and more green leaning as a teal ink. The lighter, flatter, really a result of the paper. Things to think about while choosing the paper you write on. It doesn't feather, doesn't spread. It does have all of the properties of shading. Look at properties on the second line. Tons of back and forth between darker and lighter, back to darker, back to lighter, back to darker tones. Doing a great job. Standing out against the quad rule with no problems, being a really interesting color for a student to use. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
While it's nice to see inks that are in the same color family, I prefer to find inks that complement the color on the page.
Here is Lamy Bronze.
Here is Monteverde Amethyst. Here is Birmingham Pen Company Allegheny Arsenal Gunpowder Black.
Here is Diplomat Burgundy.
The best way you can support this or any channel that you like watching is to alert the retailer of where you saw the product at time of purchase. Now, the last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Here the tone is a whole lot lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine, really looking like a different ink. Much more just a teal with that green lean to it. Now, it doesn't feather. Sorry, it does feather. You can see it in reflective. You can see it in have, the not R. It's there. It's there. The spread's normal. I don't think the feather would stop most people from using it on this paper. I don't know that it would actually stop me. I think it's about trying to choose the right pen. Perhaps a drier, finer pen here is a great option. Just be aware of what it's going to do for the color. It does have little bits of shading, but some of those shading spots can come with the tiniest amounts of feather. Looking at the back of the page, none of this bled through to touch the page underneath, but there is no taking notes on the back, or you're going to destroy both sets of notes.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
The medium flow fine of the Visconti Homo sapiens gives an ever-changing tone on the page with very present shading. Off camera, I tried this in a dry stub, and the tone was just changing with the papers, similar to what we saw in the writing sample. And it did shade a little bit more, likely because of the stub nib. I think for best results here, you have to start with the paper you plan on using. Get that perfect teal for you, then grab a dry stub and enjoy the shading that will be constant in your writing.